This is the second of our sessions on the topics of full and empty speech in the work of Jacques Lacan. And in order to prepare ourselves for that notion, particularly the notion of full speech, I think it helps just to explore a little bit more the dimensions and possibilities of speech. Of course, Lacan does a fair amount of this, and what we're going to try and do now is explore some of those ideas, but in a more accessible way, not in a hugely overly theoretical way. So the first point we should make then is, having explored in many different ways all of the problematics and challenges that come from thinking about an ego, and an ego which has as its function the cohesion, the wholeness, the pretend wholeness and cohesion of subjectivity, which thus presents a challenge to psychoanalytical work, which is precisely trying to get to those unintended speech utterances, those unintended thoughts that don't get voiced, that don't get spoken, that might slightly shift the ego. So I suppose our first important assertion today is, even if we've just done a very basic introductory amount of Lacan, we appreciate how the images of Lacan's idea of the imaginary, how images are those kinds of defense formations that get in the way of doing good psychoanalytical work, of accessing the unconscious. But what we also have now started to understand is that speech itself can function in an imaginary way. In other words, it's not just images that work to create imaginary effects. Speech can also. The particular name for that type of speech in Lacan's work is empty speech. And if we want to try and keep things as basic as possible, we can say that that empty speech, that imaginary speech, is speech which maintains as its first and foremost objective the agenda of self-substantiation, of creating an image, a viable image for the subject. And that means that empty speech is a kind of instrumental speech. It's a type of speech which tries to substantiate an ego, and it's not necessarily about truth. And indeed, it's very much about avoiding the more destabilizing, anxiety-provoking, unconscious truths that may be around or extruded by the ego. Now, having said that, we can both appreciate on the one hand about stories about me. Let's talk about me, stories about my ego, self-narratives are a problem for psychoanalysis, but we can also then start to wonder in what ways speech might be a most valuable, destabilizing kind of medium for psychoanalysis. So we can just explore both of those ideas very briefly. Number one, you could say that the very vehicle of the self-narrative, and in some qualitative research methodologies, we have an idea that the narrative is really important. Narrative work, exploring someone's narrative. Now, I don't want to dismiss that, because depending on the particular agendas of your qualitative research project, narratives are important. Narratives are the stuff of the world. Narratives are the part of subjectivity. But psychoanalytically, you could say narratives are very much a part of the problem if they function in an imaginary ego-substantiating way. So right early on, we could make a little footnote here and say, isn't it interesting that for Freud, the speech of psychoanalysis is not just about welcome, lie down on the couch, tell me your self-narrative. Yes, there is a component of that, but presumably part of the reason that Freud is so intent on coming up with this technical procedure, this innovation of free association, is precisely to disrupt the stories we like to tell about ourselves. And I think this is a kind of good maxim if one is to be a psychoanalytic practitioner, if one wants to be an analyst, one wants to be an analytically informed psychotherapist, is how do we get that balance between, yes, eliciting the narratives, getting people to speak, getting them to indulge in and articulate themselves within empty speech, which, let's be honest, is unavoidable. You got to do it. It's part and parcel of what it means to have an ego. But even within that process of being able to also ask the kinds of questions or open up the tributaries of meaning which take one out of the domain simply of self-narrativization, which after all is going to be the story I want to tell you, is going to be the way I want to present myself to you in an image that will present me in a certain kind of positive way, and try to find the tributaries of unintended meaning, to swing me out of the self-prepared, so to speak, narrative I have about myself. You could put this in different terms, and you could say this is not just the possibility of disrupting an ego speech, but it's also the disruptive possibility of learning something new, of getting the subject to stumble across upon a memory, a thought, an association, something that hadn't occurred to them. So you could also articulate this prioritization of moving out of self-narrativization as a way of how one might learn something new, how one might rediscover or explore or come across something that's been sidelined, marginalized, not thought about. So having made the case of why narrative can be a problem, we've been able to say that for Freud, the whole notion of free association, in a way you could say, disrupts that. And interestingly, some of the most controversial and most criticized technical elements of Lacan's own practice, for example, the notion of the variable session, or the example of scansion, the interruption of a session, you could say that those possibly work in a similar kind of way. I think it's an important move here because there's been so much controversy and people seem to be often quite defended against these technical innovations of Lacan, to ask how might they have also been trying to deal with some of the technical challenges that Freud wants to. And I kind of quite like the idea of the interrupted session as almost in some ways akin to Freud's idea of free association. Certainly so, in as much as they would help us to advance a slight disruption, a slight shift, a slight destabilization of ego self-narrativization. Right, so we've made a couple of examples, a couple of ideas, we've forwarded them. Let's now think about some more practical examples. Having seen that speech can be a defensive, protective, imaginary, ego-enforcing, enabling medium, how could we start to think speech and its possibilities in a way that may take us elsewhere? And the subtitle of today's mini lecture, I think, would be nicely encapsulated as something like live speech or anxious speech. So here are two scenarios I want you briefly to think about. One is that rather vexing and anxiety-provoking situation of, gosh, I really think I've got to break up with this person, or we need to renegotiate our relationship or something. And in vernacular terms, in popular culture, this is one of those we've got to talk moments. So imagine that you are about to have one of those. Now, I think we all know that if you try to do that on the fly, things don't go so well. So sometimes, presumably, you've thought about it, you're a little bit concerned about how it's going to go, so you try to find some phrase or some rationale or some, it's not you, it's me, some cliche or something. But let's just for the moment think about those anxious, nervous moments within speech. And the reason I want to do this is just so that we can try to call attention to the prospects of speech, like what can happen in live speech. Another domain of speech like that would be, another situation I'd ask you to consider, is you have been accused of crime. The accusations have been fairly well advanced. You've got to go now, come outside the institution of justice where you've been accused, and the press is all there. It helps in this example if you're a famous person. They're all wanting a comment. They all want you to say something. Again, this is an anxious domain of live speech. What do? You go up to the reporters, and we've seen this scene hundreds of times in films. The attorney's like, don't say anything, don't say anything, don't say anything. And of course, you get a bit riled and you're tempted to give an unscripted statement. And we can all imagine that in that situation, the risks of doing that are kind of catastrophic. You may end up saying something which is cited, which is quoted in a different context. You may say something beyond what you mean to say. This, I think, is an important moment because it also helps us understand something of the distinction that Lacan sometimes plays with between the dimension of the enunciation and the dimension of the statement. Now, I don't want us to get all technical about that, but you could say that there's going to be almost necessarily a difference between the statement, the content of what comes out of my mouth, and the field of enunciation. And you could understand that in different ways. How I am heard, which interestingly enough is another way of thinking about the notion of the big other. the how I am heard versus the actual statement that the words I convey. Or you could split it up differently. You could say what I intend to say, what I'm hoping to say, what my ego is trying to convey, and how it actually ends up being spoken and heard. Why do I stress those things? I'm stressing those things just to make the point that one way that Lacan revisits this famous theme within psychoanalysis, you could say the theme of subjective division. For Freud, that subjective division, that barredness, that incommensurability of the subject to themselves is most clearly articulated and announced via the dimension of the unconscious itself. The subject, the conscious subject, also has an unconscious, which interrupts them. There's a division. Lacan is also wanting to tell us that that division, that incommensurability, is enacted every time the subject tries to speak, because there's going to be an automatic, sometimes they may fit more or less okay together, but there's always going to be, at best, a minimal differentiation, a minimal juxtaposition or difference precisely between those things, the statement and the enunciation. Or, if we want to explore it differently, the words one speaks, how they're heard, or what one intends to say and how they are heard, how they're actually enunciated at a certain time and place. To reiterate, one of the reasons that we're stressing this so much is that if we start to think about live speech enunciated within certain conditions, and those conditions often seem to involve a certain minimal degree of anxiety. Think about speaking to the press, think about speaking to hundreds of people in an audience, or one of those difficult we've got to talk moments. There, speech is not one's most reliable medium. Or differently put, that's precisely its promise for Lacan and psychoanalysis, because it means that unexpected enunciations, unexpected significations might come to the fore. We can give that yet another a variation, and we could argue or think again in a kind of imaginative example, what happens to your speech, which seems to be reliable a lot of the time, which seems to make sense to you, which seems to be a way of conveying yourself. What happens to it when suddenly you're in the presence of the big other, or when suddenly you're in the presence of someone who's important, or someone who's very influential, or has a lot of say in where your career will go, or indeed someone who you're feeling in love with? If there's some kind of blossoming intensity, romantic intensity to that relationship, again, your words aren't necessarily going to be the most reliable ways to say what your ego wants them to say. And that's precisely what makes them so interesting and so valuable a medium for psychoanalysis. Let's give one other example of that. And then we'll try to link that to some priorities of clinical psychoanalysis. Another example, Lacan gets a little technical here. He looks at the work of linguists, and linguists say there's something interesting about the way I functions in everyday speech. They give it this notion of the shifter. And again, without getting overly technical, let's just imagine for a moment the statement, I love you. Now, if I'm a linguist, and if I'm interested in grammar, you could say that I, in that sentence, functions in at least two ways. One, it is a grammatical function. So I know when I hear someone say I, that the I in that sentence is referring to the speaker. It tells me that when someone uses I, it's a self-referring function within the speech. Okay? In a sense, it's a grammatical function that tells me, locates the message with respect to who it is being sent by. So that's a kind of blunt grammatical function of I. But of course, in the more ego-infused sense, I love you, is I there pertains to, as it were, the reality effects of my ego. So this may not sound like a massive disjunction, but what Lacan again is interested here is in the fact that language itself, in its spokenness, in its live enunciative dimension, reenacts division. And if language reenacts division, then it's going to be a very useful medium for doing psychoanalytical work. Now, I promised we'd look a little bit at some actual examples or how this pertains to clinical psychoanalysis or clinical psychotherapy. Let's think of a couple of examples. Already Freud is ahead of us, of course. He's been interested in the notion of a switch word or a bridge word. And the way I like to think about this is, if someone, we were talking about an ego narrative, if I'm doing my ego narrative thing, it's like I'm going down the highway, and that's the highway of my intended meaning. I'm going to rehash some familiar stories, I'm going to tell you something about myself. This is the directionality of my intended meaning. The good psychoanalyst is going to be able to also pull out the tributaries of that intended meaning. So already when he's talking about dreams, Freud is drawing our attention to the fact, he says, when you hear a dream, it's often a good idea as an interpretive strategy not to repeat the main narrative element of the dream and to investigate in that direction. Someone saying the dream's all about the house, the big old haunted house, the house, the house, the house. Freud's much more interested in, when you started speaking about it, you said there was an old carpet. Tell me about the old carpet. So this idea that you pick up a trivial event or a trivial aspect of the discourse, or in the terms that I'm using, that you would take off the side road, or if we're thinking about your mainstream of self-narrativization as a kind of body of a river, you would want to take out the little tributary and ask a question about that. So Freud is interested in these switch words, where someone is using a word and you can suddenly give it a different meaning. You can hear it in a different way. Now, sometimes the switch word could be a Freudian slip. And one brief example that comes from the supervision work that I do, an example, someone is saying in a session, and I held my breath. So the clinician goes, you said Beth. Patient goes, no, I said I held my breath. Clinician goes, Beth? And then the patient says, oh, Beth. And of course, what eventually unfolds is a whole series of hitherto unspoken associations and events and fantasies about someone called Beth. Now, sometimes those examples sound a little pat, they sound a little glib, they sound a little bit pre-prepared, and I'm not necessarily promising that those switch words emerge every session, but being able to listen for them and being able to keep out for them and throw them back to the patient who's speaking them can sometimes yield incredibly valuable clinical results. Let's offer one more idea and then we'll start to draw to a conclusion. There's a moment in Lacan's writing, I think it's in Instance of the Letter, and Bruce Fink does a really nice interpretation of it. And Lacan says something like this: the analyst must learn to listen to different staves of a musical score. Of course, that doesn't necessarily sound very easy to understand, but here's one way of thinking about it. If the analyst is listening to the different staves, the different lines of a musical score, imagine that in front of you, you've got the full musical transcription, the full score for an opera. What that means then is on that score, you're going to have not just the main melody line that gets sung, not just the violins and the cellos, but you're going to have the musical score for every single instrument in a whole orchestra. And one way, at least, of understanding or deploying this idea of Lacan's about listening to every stave or different aspects of a musical score is that when the therapist is listening to the person speaking, there's going to be, as it were, a whole stream of ego narrativization. But in the little minor details, in the possibilities of switch words, in the unintended implications of what they say, there will be other tributaries of meaning which are worthwhile exploring. So one way of thinking about it is to listen to the speech that comes from someone. And on the one hand, we're very good at prioritizing what they want to say. And we hear these kinds of slips happening all the time. Little personal anecdote. I once attended a baptism of a child. It's in like the Church of England. It was in London. And the person who was presiding over the ceremony is doing all this thing. She's got her Bible and she flips through it and she goes, oh, I've lost my faith. Oh, here it is. It was this kind of hilarious moment because, and she actually said it because I did check with people afterwards. Like everybody kind of heard it, but we all heard kind of, yeah, she didn't mean that. She meant I've lost my place. And in a way, that exactly is what her ego meant. But another meaning came out of that, another signification, I should say, to be more precise. And it's in those moments when one can open up a question. One can ask what else is being spoken by the person when they say those kinds of things. Back though to the staves in a musical score, a good analytical ear is one which can start to hear not just the main melody line, but the little instrumentation, the little piccolo, the little effect of the timpani drum or something. Those other little embellishments, those other little sounds, those other little tributaries of signification. If one gets good at that, one is able to hear a whole series, a whole polyphony, I don't know if that's even a word, a whole set of orchestrations that aren't simply limited to the main melody line. And to reiterate the point, we're very good. In a way, it's almost as if we've all been ego trained to zero in on what someone is trying to say and what they mean. Thank goodness we can do that. If we didn't have that, any instance of speech would be this staggering, chaotic, entropic, chaotic flux of different possible meanings. But in a way, the good analytical ear is going to try to do just that, to hear a whole series of unintended enunciations. If I had to give a kind of imagined image for that, a way of thinking about that in a slightly humorous way, you could say that this woman who's presiding over the service, who said, I have lost my faith. Imagine when someone speaks that there was it's like a television screen or a film screen, and you've got a whole series of subtitles underneath it. Now, to develop this idea of analytical ear, you can imagine that whenever someone speaks, they're saying something at the ego level, but in this subtitled film of that event, you would have the possible other unintended meanings, the other significations, the other staves of the musical score, and they would proliferate as someone starts to speak. Why did they use, and didn't they finish saying something here? What else could have been implied by this particular statement? It's kind of a nice way to think about how even a simple act of speaking, even a simple basic statement, brings with it a whole series of other possible hearings, another whole series or sequence of enunciations. Last thought for today then, again, is a little anecdote. A colleague, a friend of mine was at a conference, and I was there. It was a Lacanian conference, and we were chatting, and we said, like, what papers did you like? And we were chatting about it. And this colleague shared with me the idea that, oh, it's wonderful going to conferences. I said, why? He said, well, people go up, and of course they're a little bit anxious, they're a little bit nervous, there's people listening. And if you listen, you will hear so many different slips and so many disruptions in their speech that go past almost unnoticed. And I kind of liked this because it seemed to suggest that he was pretty committed to a kind of psychoanalytic agenda of training your ear to hear for those unintended significations, those unintended meanings, which may, maybe not always, but which may be very profitable to, as it were, bat back or throw back or invite the speaker to respond to as a way of clinical work. The very, very last caveat, qualification I want to make is one problem with hearing this presentation material is it sounds a little bit like the analyst is the interrogator, the one who knows better, the one who knows the meanings or the implications or the significations. I think that is a very problematic way of understanding. And I think how all of this should be articulated within the domain of clinical work is not that, aha, caught you out, I heard the thing you said that you didn't mean to say. Rather, the analyst should be the ally of the speaker. The analyst should be the person who is, in a way, calling attention to something that was signified, that something that was momentarily suggested, that act, that little episode, that little emergence that happened in their speech, that little opening, the possibility of a switch word, of a bridge, of an opening tributary. The idea is not that the analyst knows and that the analyst has some definitive interpretation. Rather, the task of the analyst is to be the person to say, you said grease boat. To invite the person then, to invite the patient, the psychoanalyst, and to say something about what seemed to emerge in their speech. The analyst wouldn't know. And in these moments, I think it's useful to refer back to the Freudian guideline. Freud makes this mention somewhere in the interpretation of dreams. At the end of the day, it's only the dreamer that can authorize an interpretation of the dream. It's not the analyst that knows. The analyst is the person that helps draw attention to a little speech event.